Salutations! This video will explore a hypothetical US military campaign against Iran. If US wants to change the regime in Iran, it might decide that the ground invasion, however costly it might be, is the way to go. Binkov won't speculate on how likely or how sane such a decision would be. The assumption will be that the invasion will happen. Could US pull it off? What would it need? And what casualties might it suffer? If US is to put troops on the ground in Iran, they're likely to feature some tank support. The venerable M1 Abrams may see combat, clashing against Iranian T-72s, but also against British and US-made Chieftains and M60s. And you can command those and many other tanks for yourself in War Thunder, which is sponsoring this video. It's an online combat game with over 1200 historically accurate and playable tanks, planes, choppers and ships. It's also free to play and is cross-platform between PC, PS4 and Xbox One. If you register through my link down below in the description, you will get a bonus premium tank or aircraft and 3 days of premium account time. If you want early Cold War jets and modern tank gameplay, War Thunder delivers. Stick around after our verdict for more info. And now the scenario continues. A later video will explore the geopolitics and alliances needed for the invasion of Iran. For now, let's jump right into the battle preparations. Binkov will assume Iraq will not be a part of the US alliance, with further explanation in a future video, which doesn't mean US may not make it a part of the attack. Unless it wants to complicate its invasion attempt immensely, US absolutely needs a land route. Iraqi territory is quite narrow at the Gulf coastline. It's also fairly unpopulated. As long as the US doesn't push too much into Iraq, north of Basra, Iraqi government may decide it's enough to harshly condemn the US invasion, but not actually offer much resistance. Kuwait has been a US ally and would likely play ball if US pressed it enough. But it's Saudi Arabia that would be key to the entire invasion attempt. Without it, US would hardly have a staging area for the war. One needs to haul in 500,000 troops or more, and countless supplies. It would be an effort comparable to the First Gulf War, more than to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Of course, months of preparation and getting the troops positioned wouldn't go unseen. Iran would have plenty of opportunity to strike those staging areas with its ballistic missiles, which is why the really close bases once in the smaller Gulf states would not likely be used, initially. US would use the Saudi ports in the Red Sea to bring in equipment and fly in troops. The numerous US air defenses would also mean Iran would not likely venture with their air forces beyond its borders, trying to mess with US buildup. Given the technology level of Iranian Air Force, which has endured sanctions for some decades now, flying such old planes into fairly modern air defenses would play right into US hand. The tables of Iranian planes represent the tallies per mission set, meaning multi-role planes are counted twice. Overall number of Iranian Air Force jets is around 300 planes. US forces would slowly get built up to much higher numbers, and that's not even counting possible additions from the Gulf countries' air forces. Over the last few years, they included roughly 4 units of half-strength squadron of various fighter jets at any one time. One carrier could also be expected to be present at any one time. Of course, these figures would sharply rise over the months of preparation. Saudi Arabian bases are fairly big with multiple runways and could be populated with many more planes. Commercial airports would also be used, as well as other bases farther away. With hundreds of air tankers available, US could afford very long flights to Iran, if necessary. Base on Diego Garcia, a British territory, could come in very handy to the US. While much is usually made of Strait of Hormuz and the vulnerability of ships in the Gulf, US fleet would most likely not even come close to the Gulf initially. Super Hornets operating from the carriers would likely be using in-air refueling, so the carrier fleets can be on the safe side. Iranian Navy is simply not designed for operations outside the Gulf. They lack large ships and large sea-going submarines in sufficient numbers. Their midget subs lack endurance under the sea, and when they would approach surface to recharge batteries, they would be more vulnerable. And Iranian various coastal anti-ship batteries are too short-ranged. Even their most potent weapon is likely not going to be in range, and in reality locating and tracking any target to shoot at farther than a few hundred kilometers from Iranian shores would be very hard. Planes, submarines, or ships that Iran might hope to send to scout would likely not be able to go unnoticed hundreds of kilometers over the ocean. Majority of Iranian fleets are missile boats, not designed for open ocean. Most of their ships lack air defenses, and their main weapons are Chinese-designed subsonic anti-ship missiles. While those could be dangerous to US ships, they would need to have targets designated beforehand. US is thus unlikely to enter the Gulf right away, before most of the Iranian fleet is dealt with from the air, from afar. US could bring in a lot of troops, given enough time. 500,000 troops were considered for Iraq in 2003, though final plans used a lot less. This time against Iran, 500,000 might be just the starting point. It really depends on what sort of alliance US could assemble. But even if the alliance is minimal and consists of only Saudis, Kuwait, UAE and Oman, for example, it might still amount to some 200,000 extra troops. Saudis would likely not be able to use up all of their troops due to ongoing conflict in Yemen, because part of their forces would be used there. Keep in mind, these figures represent total ground troops. Only a part of those would actually be at any one time inside Iran. For example, only 30% of total US troops for 2003 war in Iraq were actually inside Iraq. Counting in various Air Force and Navy personnel involved, it's plausible US and/or its alliance would wait until they have around 1 million military personnel in the Middle East. And then they would attack with only part of that crossing into Iran, eventually to number some 300,000. Iranian military is large on paper, but not directly comparable to US one. Most of their troops are conscripts, not professional soldiers. Its Revolutionary Guard is a parallel military organization. It's better paid, tasked with upkeeping the internal peace, but also trained for military ops. Unlike US reserves, and especially its National Guard, which trains a lot, Iranian reserves get very little training. Same can be said for most of the US Gulf Allies armies though. So initially Iranians might outnumber the coalition, especially considering they would have a larger mobilization pool. As always, before any serious attempt to send troops into Iran, an extensive air campaign would have to begin, so air support could be provided to those troops on the ground. With all those bases available, US would position several hundred of its Air Force planes nearby. Several weeks of bombing would begin, while US would assess the number of Iranian leftover missiles and whittle down Iranian strike aircraft inventory. Gradually, more and more planes would be brought in, populating even the more forward bases along the Gulf Coast. A huge force would slowly be assembled, first on the Red Sea coastline, then moved via Riyadh to Kuwait. Iran would of course have the option of preventively going through Iraq and invade Kuwait, but that would ruin its position politically even more and might turn Iraq against it. And such protrusion away from Iranian homeland would be hard to secure in the long term. A more likely course of events would be Iran fortifying its position along its border and using the river as a major obstacle to US. If indeed Iraq does not let the US go north of Basra and use its country to enter Iran, the Euphrates and Tigris water flow would not be an easy crossing. Still, with enough time and firepower as well as air assaults and even amphibious assaults, the beachhead and riverheads could eventually be secured. Due to the need for air superiority and neutralization of Iranian hold on the strait, that might not happen within first several weeks from start of the hostilities. From then on, the battle would be different. While the front line would get very wide very fast, the flat lands would eventually be replaced by hills and mountains. Zagros mountains are a fairly long chain, and they would make it very hard to move hundreds of thousands of troops and their supplies through the narrow passes. Iranian mountain ambushes would be very frequent and very dangerous. The topography would also make it hard to fully utilize the technological edge US enjoys in recon, as aerial recon assets would need to fly more overhead and get closer to the threat. Standoff weapons would also be harder to use in such topography. Just how many soldiers could Iran muster in such time frame is hard to say. Initial 500,000 troops would definitely be aided by mobilized populace, perhaps adding another million by the time US decides to cross into Iran. Major component of any army is its proficiency and its morale. Iranian proficiency would be fairly poor, as most of that army would be mobilized population with little to no training. A few 100,000 troops would have some 2 years of training. Of course, the Gulf Alliance countries' troops don't have as much training as US, and are perhaps closer to Iranians in that regard, and their morale may be even worse than Iranian. But the morale factor is impossible to predict. Back in 1990, various US Army estimates offered a wide range of bleak figures. Those did not come to pass. Simply, there was no way to predict just how much the Iraqis were going to fight for Saddam. Indeed, a lot of them did surrender without a fight. Equally so, it's impossible to predict the surrender rate of Iranians. If most of their soldiers do fight for the Iranian cause, US would be in for a very long and very bloody fight. The mountainous topography of Iran would not help, as a contrast to mostly flat Iraq. Months of heavy fighting pushing towards Tehran and other targets would not be out of the question. Crossing hundreds of miles would be quite a strain on the logistics, and if Iranian morale does fly high, the US coalition might be looking at tens of thousands of dead in the first weeks of the ground war. Indeed, just getting near Tehran might not result in Iran's defeat. Taking such a city would be also immensely hard due to its size, and a lot more of the country might need to be conquered before the country destabilizes enough for a new government to be put in place. Predicting such events is nearly impossible. If the Iranian government collapses due to internal unrest, possibly mere months would pass, with US casualties stopping at the aforementioned tens of thousands. But equally possible is that a year or two or more would be needed, and that US casualties could go much higher, perhaps a few times higher than those of Vietnam. Vietnam was another kind of a war, where South Vietnamese army suffered most casualties, and both US and South Vietnam were mostly tasked with defense and counterstrikes, not conquering enemy lands. Ultimately, US invasion of Iran might even eclipse US World War I casualties. Precisely because it's so hard to guess US casualties, it's also hard to imagine US would actually seriously consider launching a land invasion into Iran. An extensive air campaign lasting a year or two, if necessary, and coupled with near total blockade of trade with the Western world, would do extreme damage to Iran as well, with next to negligible casualties to US in comparison. The Iranian Air Force would be no match for the US planes, as the Air Force needs bases and significant infrastructure that's fixed and fairly easily kept under a constant stream of bombs. Whatever air losses US endures could be replaced with new planes brought into the region. Iranian air defenses would present more of a long-term threat, simply due to the fact those SAM systems would scoot around and slowly nibble away at the US. Exact inventory of Iranian SAM systems is hard to deduce. The tables presented are a rough estimate. Still, it is evident the fairly modern and fairly long-range systems are not very plentiful, considering the area of Iran which needs protection. With advances in stealth, jamming and geolocation of radar emissions since the war in Iraq, neutralization of most of Iran's air defenses is assured, whether it takes months or a year, depending on how much and where Iran decides to use them. Still, flying over enemy territory on long-range missions, especially if round-the-clock air support is required to the troops on the ground, means US planes would oftentimes be targeted. Even if just a small part of those attacks succeed, air losses would be inevitable. Total US air casualties might be quite a bit more numerous than in recent wars, perhaps even reaching the ones of the Gulf War of '91. That's if no ground war needs to be supported. If combat air support missions are included, US may lose perhaps even several hundred planes, drones and helicopters. The last option mentioned in this video will be one of no support for US war. If even the likes of Saudi Arabia and other countries don't allow US forces and overflights, US would almost certainly not even attempt a serious war. At best, it could use several carriers and some bases far away, using in-air refueling, to do some symbolic airstrikes inside Iran. Furthermore, with sporadic control of the air, or just some parts of Iran, any sort of successful troop landing would be impossible. Moving ships thousands of miles across the sea and disembarking whatever troops they could carry would be futile, as all those troops would eventually get outnumbered and cut off from supplies. Simply put, without Gulf states' assistance, US would not risk its troops. But such course of political events is extremely unlikely, and in the real world, US is assured to come out victorious if it sticks to just an air campaign. It would hurt Iranian forces, damage the economy and slow down Iranian development of nuclear weapons. But the goal of overthrowing the Iranian government may not be met. While a ground invasion does increase chances of a government change, the risks to the US increase as well. Depending on Iranian morale and US casualties, the war might drag on for years. And in that case, it's impossible to predict when the various future US administrations might pull the plug and leave Iran if the goal is not yet met. Before you go, try out War Thunder. It's free to play and there are over 20 million people playing. If you like Cold War vehicles, this is your game. I loved getting my hands on the T-80, Leopard 2 and British Challenger 2. But there's vehicles, ships and aircraft ranging from 1930s all the way to the Cold War and 1990s. There are also different game modes available, from arcade to simulator. If you want realistic physics and detailed damage models, where tanks suffer damage to their components, depending on where they are hit, this is your game. And War Thunder gets updated every few months. New vehicles, maps and gameplay features keep getting added. So hit that link down below into the video description. When you do, War Thunder will give you a bonus premium tank or aircraft and 3 days of premium account time, giving you a kickstart. Oh, and big thanks to Son of Cyrus for his support, as well as to other patrons and fans. Without you, this channel wouldn't be so successful. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.